Hello everyone, this is Mitchie, and welcome back to the Manic Manor podcast. Today's episode, we are going to talk about the deadliest aviation disaster in history, and that will be the crash on the Tenerife Islands. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the Tenerife Islands is an extremely popular tourist destination with millions of people going each year, and we're going all the way back into 1977, March 27th of 1977 to be exact. And this is when a group of tourists were bound for the islands on two separate flights. There were two Boeing 747s, one was with KLM and the other was with Pan Am Airlines. Combined, there were 650 passengers, 248 in KLM, 396 in Pan Am, and both of them were eager to get to their destinations. Now, the flight to the island was supposed to be a non-stop flight into Gran Canaria Airport, which was also known as Las Palmas Sargando Airport. However, the islands were dealing with domestic terrorists at the time, and a bomb had been planted in the airport by a group called the Canary Island Independence Movement. This bomb detonated in the airport, injuring 8 people in the process, and fearing that there would be a second bomb or further attacks, the airport was temporarily closed, and all the incoming flights for Gran Canaria were now being diverted to Los Rodeos Airport. Now, Los Rodeos was a much smaller airport not designed to take on such a load of planes. The main bulk of the airport was only meant for smaller aircrafts, not the Boeing size type of planes that we had coming in from KLM and Pan Am. And the parking there, like I said, it was just super small. It could barely fit the incoming plane traffic that was coming on a daily basis. Now, of all the planes being redirected to the airport, the two that we are discussing, the KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736, they were inbound for there as well. Pan Am had been flying since Los Angeles, making a stop in New York before heading to the islands. Naturally, these people are going to be completely exhausted and ready to land after a long trip. Now, KLM was being flown by a star captain, which was Jacob van Zenten, and he was actually the face of the KLM magazines. Now, one major thing to be mentioned for the KLM pilots, since they were Dutch, they had rules in place that only allowed pilots to fly for so many hours before they had to be grounded. And if they flew over those hours, they could risk even losing their pilot's license. And KLM still had to drop off their passengers in the islands and fly back to Amsterdam before the time ran out. So the fact that they were being diverted made for a super tight time crunch for them. Now, on top of the time crunches, it was super frustrating for the passengers as well, which, of course, no pilot wants to have to deal with. But what made matters worse was because this occurred on a weekend, Los Rodeos only had like 2 air traffic controllers in the tower on that day, which normally would be plenty for an airport of that size, but due to this diversion, it made for mass stress. Now, the airport was extremely crowded, and there were all sorts of planes that were being parked and boxed in, and in order to get these planes out, they would have to do what is known as taxiing down the runway individually, one by one, which means it's just them making their way down the runway, then they would have to turn and take off. Now, after all that, it would become this painstaking issue for the 2 air traffic controllers as well as each pilot, because they had to make sure that these pilots were getting clear instructions to avoid anything catastrophic from happening. But before they could take off, there was going to be this extensive wait time, and it was a traffic jam that Los Rodeos had never seen before. Now, KLM, I should mention this because it is the deadliest air disaster in history. There were many people who died as a result of what we're going to talk about today. Only one person was the sole survivor of KLM, and that was because when she got off the plane, when they were deboarding at Los Rodeos, she didn't reboard. Her name was Robina van Lenschot, and she remembers one of her friends that she was talking with talking about how he had such a bad feeling about the airport situation going on as they were getting off the plane, and how he just felt like something was going to go wrong, which is very eerie when you think about what actually happens. Now, Lots of people, they were directed into the small terminal of Los Rodeos while they were grounded, just simply to pass the time, but it got so full that eventually people couldn't go into the terminal, and this meant the people of Pan Am, when they landed, they couldn't go in. So they had to stay in the plane, which was an even more frustrating experience when you think about flying for like 12, 13, 14 hours and not being allowed to even walk and stretch your legs. But eventually they were allowed to walk on the tarmac enough to give their legs a stretch. Now, the weather had been turning gloomy and misty over the airport, and it set for a very ominous experience. It was also concerning for the pilots because a dense fog meant that they could not take off. As mentioned for KLM, this could mean that they would lose their licenses, or they would be going over their flight time and they would be grounded. Now, out of all the KLM passengers, like I said, the sole survivor, Robina, made a decision that would ultimately save her life. She had a boyfriend that was in the area at the time that she wanted to see, so she ended up deciding not to board the plane again against what the airline policy said, because they were going to tell her that no matter what, she had to get back on the plane, but she was just like, you know what, fuck that, I'm not getting back on the plane. So when Las Palmas finally decided that they were going to reopen and the planes could be diverted back to them, she would not be on this fateful flight. Ironically, at this time, the KLM pilot Yakov decided that he should go ahead and refuel the plane there at Los Rodeos instead of, fueling at Las Palmas or anything like that, because he had this time crunch and he was just like fighting against the clock. So because he was the star pilot, he had the final say, and this would lead to a disastrous domino effect. The pilot decided he needed to refuel enough to get him all the way back to Amsterdam versus just the standard practice of refueling enough to get to one stop at a time, plus a little bit of margin for error. And that's going to cause the plane to be tremendously heavy. Now, for Robina, this would be the last time that she would see her friends as she was waving them off and they were reboarding the plane. Now, the weather, it continued to worsen at Los Rodeos, and despite this, some planes were still able to move because, well, they weren't actually able to move because of KLM's refueling. Mainly Pan Am Air, who was like right in behind KLM. Pan Am tried to squeeze past the KLM jet, but unfortunately it was just too narrow of a path. So this set them back even more, and it was so frustrating. And to make matters worse, for the KLM flight, there was a family that had not been accounted for, and that caused a further delay because the people at the airport had to go look for them. It took an airport worker running around and finally locating them and sending them off onto the plane. And what is so sad about it was he was sending them off to their demise. Now, after hours of delays and frustration, the KLM finally gives the word that they're ready to go and taxi down the runway so they can finally take off, which was a big relief for the Pan Am flight because they could finally take off as well. It should have been something clear-cut if the weather was great, but the visibility just kept getting worse by the minute. In fact, it was so bad that passengers, if they were to look out their window, they would not be able to see hardly past the wing of the plane. So the KLM began to position itself for takeoff. Pan Am is a few hundred meters behind KLM, preparing for their takeoff as well, and the air controller had told them to follow KLM and then backtrack down the runway. So as Pan Am made their way down the runway, another wave of fog began to come down on them. And according to the Pan Am co-pilot, they had maybe 500 meters of visibility, and they couldn't see KLM whatsoever. They were just trusting by what the air traffic controller was telling them at this point. Now, Yakov in the KLM didn't want to spend the night anywhere. He wanted to be able to quickly get back to Amsterdam, so he was in a major rush that really should have been the last of his priorities with the situations going on, but he was the star pilot. I don't think he wanted to tarnish his reputation or anything like that. So he was in this very narrow mindset. Pan Am was concerned with getting off the runway before KLM was to take off, because the way that it was going, KLM would come barreling towards them before they could turn off and, avoid a catastrophe. They asked the air controller where they would need to go to turn off. They were informed to take the third exit to their left. Now, this left a lot of confusion for the pilots, because they didn't know if they meant the third exit or the third exit from the last one that they had passed. The third to the Pan Am's left would have made for an impossible turn. It would have been a 90-degree angled turn. The next turn up ahead would have been a more probable cause for them to turn off, because it was only 45 degrees of an angle. On top of that, their minimum visibility that they should be able to take off was 700 meters, but according to the co-pilot, he felt like they only had 500 meters of visibility. Now, eventually, they decided that they were just going to have to take that 45-degree angle. However, they would have to do it very slowly because of the visibility issues. Another issue was the air controller was working essentially blind, to everybody's dismay, because they didn't have any visibility of the runway either, and this airport at the time did not have a more modern radar to keep track of everything, so they were just eyeballing it, and with the fog, it was nearly impossible for them to see anything. So really, it was a matter of, we're trusting the planes to do what they need to do, and the planes are trying to trust the air controller to do what they need to do. Now, on KLM, Yakov is becoming more antsy to take off due to the weather. They turn and prepare to take off just after 5 p.m. With Pan Am and KLM unable to see each other, they have no clue of the disaster that they're heading for. Without any clearance from the air controller, Yakov tries to take off, and it's his co-pilot that tells him to hold up, they need to get the clearance, which was the ATC clearance. It isn't a permission to take off, but it just gives instructions on what to do. They have to wait for further clearance to be able to actually take off. But even so, Yakov still decided to take off, which was against air traffic control and Pan Am warning them that they were still on the runway. However, fate was extremely unkind this day. Pan Am and air traffic control spoke at the same time into the radio when they were telling him to wait, and because of that and the overlaying of the messages, it left nothing but static in the KLM pilot's ears. So the KLM pilot would have heard nothing, so they would assume, okay, we can just take off, which sealed their fate. The last thing said on Pan Am was that they would report when they were clear, and that report would go unheard. Now the KLM keeps picking up speed right as Pan Am is trying to turn off. The Pan Am sees KLM, and they're trying to avoid it, but the plane is too fast and way too heavy, barreling down at them. KLM would not be able to lift off the ground fast enough and would crash right into Pan Am and clip the top of the plane clear off before it would crash into a fireball. Now, Robert Bragg, who was the co-pilot of Pan Am, remembers saying that he felt the plane shake and there was a loud crash. There were survivors on Pan Am, and those survivors recalled thinking that a bomb had gone off and had gotten onto their plane, and a lot of them were praying to God that they would survive. Now, it was only a matter of seconds, and the plane was on fire, the windows were busted out, people were in such a state of shock. The flight attendants that had managed to survive shouted out that there was a fire. They were trying to open the door, but they recalled the door crumbling like it was absolutely nothing. And looking down, they realized that they were all going to have to jump from the plane. Survivors ended up standing on debris of the plane as this plane was burning. There were oxygen bottles in the plane that were exploding as people were trying to rush to get out of Pan Am. one man jumped from the plane to catch his wife, and he ended up having to drag her because she was in so much pain, and he had actually fractured his leg or his foot himself while he was jumping out of the plane. Now, sadly, not everybody made it out alive, whether it be because of smoke inhalation, the impact, or the flames. For Pan Am, there was only 61 people who managed to get out of the plane alive, and the death toll would slowly over time raise to 583 people, making it one of the deadliest, if not actually the deadliest, aviation disaster in history. Now, the fire and the smoke was so bad that when firefighters arrived on site, they were just focused on KLM because, like I said, KLM went up in a fireball that was so massive that there were no survivors on that plane. It was so bad that they could not even tell that there was a second plane on fire behind KLM because of the inferno. The Dutch plane demolished, everyone was dead, and it would take 20 minutes before firefighters would realize that Pan Am was there as well. Now, the fire got so bad and so hot, it ripped the oxygen clear from people's lungs. The survivors remember saying that it just sounded like a void. Anybody who was stuck in that eventually, if they were still alive by some miraculous thing, would suffocate because the oxygen was gone. Now, the survivors were taken to the hospital nearby by taxi cabs, personal cars, and trucks because there was just so many people that it overwhelmed first responders. Now, there was one passenger who survived. When she was taken to the hospital, she ran up to the doctors because she was a doctor herself and said that she wanted to help before the doctors told her, no, we've got this, you need to look after yourself, and then she eventually fell into a coma. Then it hit the news all around the world. It was listed as the world's worst aviation accident. The investigation went underway, and a temporary morgue was set up in one of the nearby hangars at the airport while they were recovering bodies. But the ultimate question came: how and why did this happen? How could it happen? Spain, Holland, and the United States all had investigators come in because they had their own people, their planes involved in this wreck, they had a right to be there. Now, initially, the Spanish general at the time didn't want to allow the U.S. in the room to investigate until he found that he had something in common with one of the American investigators. Now, both of them were born in Cuba. One was dealing with Spain, the other was an American. They slowly started to uncover the chain reactions during their investigation. So we're just going to boil it down to the chain reactions right now. The first and most obvious being that there was a terrorist bombing at Las Palmas Airport. Second being that they were relocated to Los Rodeos, which was way too small to sustain the planes and was ill-equipped. Third, there was only 2 air traffic controllers that Sunday afternoon, and they were stuck with a major puzzle to try to fix. Fourth, the stress of the KLM pilots because of their constraints would result in severe penalties. Fifth, KLM decided to refuel, which not only delayed but heavied the plane. Sixth, during the refueling, the weather became much more foggy and caused visibility issues. Seventh, there weren't any center lights on the runway that they found during the investigation, which made the visibility even much worse. And finally, KLM took off without proper clearance while Pan Am was still on the runway. Now, at the time, the Dutch tried to place the blame on the Pan Am flight, saying that they shouldn't have even been on the runway. However, they could only go to the 45-degree angle taxiway, which was the most logical for the plane. So, that didn't matter. the KLM pilot took off without any permission. All the time in the simulators that he had been working, because it came to the realization, it came to light, that he had not actually flown a plane in a long time. So all that time in the simulators worked against him. This was his first flight in quite a while, actually. Now, people wondered why the crew, his co-pilot, the first mate, had not stopped him, and the answer became clear. The pilot Yakov looked at himself like he was a god. He was always right, everybody else was wrong, and his final say was the word. Anyone below him would not dare try to correct him, even in the most obvious of flaws, because it would lead to the worst outcome possible. And boy, did it lead to the worst outcome possible for humanity. Now, the official report written by Spain blamed the KLM captain, but the Dutch, as I said, refused to accept it. They wrote their own report and simply blamed miscommunication and language difficulties. However, it was clear for all to see the face of KLM was the cause, and a massive settlement payout would take a total of roughly $2 billion to be paid out. Now, to date, this remains the deadliest aviation disaster in the history of the world, and it goes to show that no matter how senior you may be, how accredited you can be, we are all still human and capable of mistakes and errors, and it's best to always err on the side of caution instead of trying to protect your own skin when it comes to others' lives. So that is the story of the Tenerife disaster. Thank you guys so much for listening into today's episode. If there was anything else that you would like to add in or something I got wrong, please feel free to let me know. You can reach out at manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast, and you can comment on my YouTube channel as well. As always, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, a wonderful week. Everything goes your way. And as always, I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.